As we continue our journey exploring the life of King David, I'm going to share with you a story today that doesn't always come to mind when you think about David's life and all that he did. In fact, it's a story that many people don't know, and those of us who might know it sometimes don't really think about it, and maybe we've even forgotten the story. Some people just don't see it as that big a deal, as that important of a story in his life. And yet what I would argue is it's one of the most important stories in David's life, because it teaches us what kind of king David was, what kind of person that he was. And in seeing what kind of king he was, I think we also learn something about what kind of God we have. Because in this story today, we're going to see the Spirit of God work itself out through the life of David in, I think, a pretty compelling way. Let me set the stage for you just to kind of get you caught up in a very broad sense as to where we are in the journey. When David was a boy, he is anointed by Samuel as the future king of Israel. He eventually finds himself in the court of the current king at that time, a guy named Saul, and he originally went to be a court musician. But David rises in the ranks very quickly, becomes a soldier, becomes a leader of the people, and also becomes very beloved by the people of Israel. Because of that, Saul begins to see him as a threat and begins to threaten his life and even attempts to take his life a couple of times. So David is on the run. David has left the court. David and his men and their families, about 600 men and their families, they've fled to the wilderness. And over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about that journey through the wilderness and what that's looked like for them and some of the challenges that they have faced. In order to get to today's story, I need to backtrack just a little bit before David left the palace, because I need to tell you real quickly about a relationship that David had with Saul's son named Jonathan. David and Jonathan were very close to one another, so close, in fact, that Jonathan was willing to intercede on David's behalf to try to settle his father, the king, down just a little bit. Jonathan and David were very, very close. As the story progresses and as things begin to unfold, Jonathan sees the writing on the wall. He is the king's son. He is a devoted son to Saul, but he also can tell that there is change in the wind and that Saul's reign is coming to an end, and Jonathan knows that David is going to be the next king. And so Jonathan goes to David and he asks him to do him a favor. He asks David that when his time comes and he takes over the throne, that he would show mercy to Jonathan's family and to Saul's family. Now, the reason that this is important is because in that day and age, when there was a shift or a change in power, when a new king took over, the old king and anything connected to the old king was considered to be a threat, and justifiably so. And so what would happen often is after the power had shifted, family members, members of the court, people who had served that king, all of them are executed so that they present no more threat into the future. And if you didn't do that, it wasn't uncommon for there to be an insurrection, and you would have to deal with that later. So as Jonathan sees that there's going to be a shift in power and David is going to take over as king, Jonathan is worried for his family and the people that he loves. And so he just asks David, will you have compassion for my family? David says, yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that. So time passes, and we get through the rest of the story, and we kind of get up to where we are now in the story, and everything begins to fall apart for Saul. Some battles are lost. Some bad decisions are made. It's clear that the kingdom is slipping away from him. Saul dies. Jonathan dies. The time for David to take over the throne has come. And as David moves into that position of power, the people who were connected to Saul's reign begin to get nervous. Now, Jonathan had one son. His name was Mephibosheth. Now, I'm going to say that name multiple times this morning, and I may or may not say it as well as I just said it a moment ago. but I encourage you to try that this afternoon 2 or 3 times in a row, Mephibosheth. It does not exactly roll off the tongue. Jonathan had a son that he unfortunately named Mephibosheth, because if he just called him Sam, today would have been a lot easier. So Mephibosheth is his only son, and Mephibosheth has a nursemaid, and when the nursemaid hears that Saul and Jonathan are dead and that David is about to take over, the nursemaid is afraid for Mephibosheth's life because she doesn't know about the promise. She assumes that the new king is going to kill every family member of the old king. So she takes Mephibosheth and they run. And when I say run, they are literally running. As they run, they fall. And it's not just a skin your knees, rub some dirt in it, get up and go kind of fall. It breaks Mephibosheth. Multiple bones are broken in his body. So his nursemaid scoops him up, this small broken boy, and she carries him all the way to a place called Lo Debar. In Hebrew, Lo Debar means no pasture. They go to a place that is literally called no pasture. Why? Because it is so barren, so harsh, so dangerous that no one would dare take their animals and put them out to pasture there because they would die. So here is Mephibosheth with his nursemaid, brokenhearted because his family is gone, and broken-bodied in this place of no pasture. It's important just to note that back in the day, and we've talked about this before, if you suffer any kind of disability, it's just like some illnesses and other things. It doesn't matter how it came into your life. Often those disabilities, illnesses, and injuries cause you to be put on the margins of society. You were seen as not equal and not fully human, and they were marginalized. So now he's not only broken in body, he's not only broken in spirit, he's at risk. It's a dangerous place for any person in his condition. Meanwhile, back at the palace, back in Israel, David has taken over the throne. He's now the king, and according to Scripture, when he begins his reign, he begins to rule with justice, with mercy, with righteousness, with faith. He is everything everyone had hoped that he would be. He was a fantastic ruler and leader of God's people. But as he is settling in to his reign, he remembers the promise that he made to Jonathan. And so he begins to ask the question, are there any living relatives of Saul and Jonathan? Does anyone remain? Now, at this point, people don't know about the promise, but they know what that question would often lead to. And so I imagine as David's walking around asking if there's any living relatives, people are assuming he wants to know the names of the relatives so that he can end their lives and end their threat. And so people aren't real forthcoming, understandably. But finally, there's a servant in the court. His name is Ziba. Ziba confesses that he knows where the son of Jonathan is. And so he goes to David and he says, Jonathan had a son. His name is Mephibosheth, and he is with his nursemaid where they have made their home in the land of Lo Debar. David sends a servant to Lo Debar to summon Mephibosheth to the palace. Mephibosheth does not know of the promise, but Mephibosheth knows his history. Mephibosheth assumes that this is the end of the road for him. But where's he going to run? And how's he going to run? He's a grown man now. His nursemaid isn't going to scoop him up in her arms and carry him off. He knows he has no choice. I mean, the king's people are there to get him. So he goes back to the palace, and as he comes into the courtroom where David is, understandably, Mephibosheth is terrified. And he kind of hobbles his way into the room, and he is so afraid and so worried that his strength just gives way and he falls to the floor, waiting to hear word about his fate. And in that moment, King David does what no other king in that day and age would do. Instead of ordering the execution of the remaining family member of the previous king, David reaches out and offers comfort to Mephibosheth. You're okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I made a promise to your dad. I'm going to keep that promise. Mephibosheth, I want you to rise as much as you can. And Mephibosheth stood before the king, and the king said, here's what's going to happen. Not only are you going to live, I'm going to give you the land that was once your grandfather's, that was once your father's. Because that land is not mine, that land is yours. It's your family. I'm going to give you the land of Saul. And you're going to go and you're going to make your home there. And you're going to be safe there. But I'm not just going to give you land, because I know you need more than that. I'm going to give you servants and nursemaids who can help you not just live but thrive. They're going to take care of the needs that you can't take care of yourself. And I'm not only going to give you the people to take care of you and the home in which you can live, you're never going to have to pay for that. I'm going to take care of all of it for you, because I made a promise to your dad. I'm going to keep that promise. As if that wasn't enough, David goes one step further and does something that no one could have pictured him doing. He tells Mephibosheth that from that point on, he has a place at the king's table. He has a seat at the king's table. Now, the king's table, that's where everybody wanted to be. The king's table was the place where all the people of power and privilege would gather. The king's table was the place where anyone who was anyone wanted to go. Mephibosheth has been given a place at the king's table. And not only is he given a place at the king's table, David tells him very clearly, that place is yours forever. You are getting a permanent place at the king's table. Now, a lot of people at the king's table, they came and went based on their position of power and influence. And it was kind of a rotating seating chart. To have permanent place was a big deal. Now here's where the story really gets shocking for the people who already had place at the king's table, right? These are the people of power, the people of privilege, the people who were all the important people in the realm. They're there at the king's table, and imagine what they thought the first time Mephibosheth hobbles in. Broken, disabled, someone that many of them saw as less than, not fully equal, and certainly not worthy of being at the place of highest power and privilege in all of the land. And when he showed up, I guarantee you some of them sitting around that table said, "What is he doing here?" And I bet more than once King David had to say, "He's here because I want him to be here. And no one can ever tell him to leave, because he has place at my table." In this moment where David has not just the opportunity, but really every reason in the world to take the life of Mephibosheth, he not only spares his life, he gives him an abundant life, and even places him at the most important seat of power there is. David leverages his ability to offer grace and compassion in a way that not only changed Mephibosheth, but changed the kingdom, because it served as a model for how they were going to move forward from this day on. As I was thinking about this morning and trying to figure out which direction to go with this story, because I think there's a lot of lessons in this story. What I settled on, for better or worse, I'll let you decide that, is I want to talk today about what it means to give people place at table. I think there's some things that are going on in our society and in our communities where we're struggling to figure out who has a place And if they have a place, what is their place? And who gets to decide whether they get to be there or not? And who gets to decide once they're there how much power and privilege and place they actually have? I think there's a lot of this conversation that's happening for us, right? And part of it, I'm going to sit down, and you when a preacher sits down, you think, wow, mostly when preachers want to say something, they stand up and they point. When they sit down, we know we're in for it. But really, the reason that I want to sit down, because do you remember some time ago we were talking about church relevancy? Like, what's the place in the church? And what's the role in the church? And are we relevant? And what does it mean for us to be relevant? Well, sometimes it means for us to have some difficult conversations, right? And to look at what's happening in Scripture and to figure out from the stories in Scripture how it is that we're called to live our faith, even where it's uncomfortable and even where it's challenging. What does that mean for us, right? And sometimes for fear of disruption or fear of discomfort, we don't talk about the challenging and difficult stuff. We kind of just, even as the world is falling apart around us, right? We pretend, we just motor on. But what we've heard from you is that when we motor on in here without paying attention to what's going on out there, we're not equipping ourselves to live with the realities beyond these doors. We got to equip ourselves for that. And how do we equip ourselves? We got to talk. And as I've been looking and looking at this story and looking at the world in which we live and seeing what's going on, one of the things, I'm seeing a couple things. One of the things that I'm seeing is a lack of compassion, and we're going to get to that. But where I'm seeing that play out sometimes is around the decisions that we make about who gets to sit where and who gets what. Let me give you an example. Let's talk about the Mephibosheths of the world. When I say let's talk about the Mephibosheths of the world, I mean let's talk about people who are disabled, who have some kind of disability or illness or injury that puts them in a place where they don't have the ability that those of us without those have to operate and function, right? Who gets to decide what kind of accessibility and what kind of access that people with disabilities in our society have at table? Who gets to decide that, and how is that decided? How do we figure out as a people how we're going to do what David did, and that is make room for someone that may not always be able to make room for him or herself? How do we do that? Now, if we take this as an example, often what happens when we come to figure out how we're going to increase accessibility for people who are differently abled, guess who tends to make those decisions? The people who aren't differently abled, right? Because typically people without disabilities are the ones who are sitting around the tables that are of authority and influence and policy. And so that group is the one that's making decisions about how we're going to do this and how we're going to welcome and how we're going to make a place. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't advocates and people talking and people pushing and people doing those kinds of things that those folk listen to. But what happens is, if we're going to make a place for someone who is disabled, then we have to leverage our power and position to do that. Because we don't need those accommodations, right? And this just came up. I was at a meeting and we were talking about accessibility to the table. Right? If you look at this table, the only way to get to this table is to climb steps. Do you know what that means? That means currently, if we're going to have someone pray behind the table, they have to be able-bodied. They got to be able to get up and down those steps, right? What does that mean for us? And how are we dealing with that? We have to decide that. We have to make decisions about that. And sometimes that means that we have to use resources and funds and time and money to make sure that those who are differently able have equal access that we have, right? And we do that because it's the right thing and the compassionate thing. But it means that we have to leverage something we have and, in a sense, give it away, even though we don't have to do it. Let's talk about another one. You'll love this one. Let's talk about immigration for just a minute. I don't know if you know this. There's a lot of conversation about immigration right now. Bottom line, you know what that conversation's about? Who has seat at what table? Who gets to come and sit down at what table? And when they sit down at that table, what rights and privileges do they have? And what rights and privileges do they not get? And who is making the decisions about who gets to sit at that table and who doesn't? Right? It's about who has place at table. Does this person have it? Does this person have it? Right? We've come a long way in our country regarding issues of race, but there are still moments in our country where people of color do not have the same place at table that other people have. I was taking my son back to school on Friday. If you don't know, my oldest son, Ethan, he's African American, and so he lives in brown skin. And he did not know what I was preaching about today. But on the way back to school, he asked today's question. He said, "Dad, I don't know that there's place for me in the same way that there is place for my white peers." He said, "That is different." He said, "And I don't know that there's place for me here." Right? It's real. It's there. That's the experience of his life. And he's got reason to ask that question. Women, right? We've come a long way in terms of women's place. But there are still tables where women don't have voice and authority in the same way and at the same level of their male counterparts. Right? Who gets to decide where women get to sit and where their voices get to be heard? Well, guess what? Sometimes it's men. And they've got to leverage that to make room at the table. Last week, several members of our congregation went over to the Fraser History Museum, and we participated in a conversation about whether or not there was room at the table in the Christian community for members of the LGBTQ plus community. Is there room for them here? What does that mean? When you begin to boil it down, think about all the things that while they may be about policy, procedure, and laws and rules and all that stuff, think about all the things we're confronting as a people today and think about them in the context of who gets a seat at the table. Access to health care. Access to quality education. Access to affordable housing. In the church, access to the table. Access to ordination, access to positions of privilege and power. Who gets to decide those things? And how do we decide those things? You see, so much of what we're talking about in our world today and in our lives, and it's not just big policy decisions and all that stuff, sometimes it's personal. Who are we letting in to our personal table? And who gets to sit with us and who gets to be with us? And look, the things that we've talked about this morning, these are big ticket items. These are really hard, complicated issues. And I don't have the solutions for them. They're way over my pay grade, right? And I'm not here to argue and tell you what the solutions need to be. In fact, this is what I think is true and what I've seen, is that when it comes to making the decisions about who gets placed at table and what it means for us as we work through these issues, I don't always see compassion at the center of that conversation. Now, I'm not suggesting that compassion isn't part of the conversation, but what I'm suggesting is sometimes it's pretty far down the list when it comes to the decisions that we make. And long before we get to compassion, we got issues of funding and finance and fairness and laws and precedents and position and power and all those kinds of things. And sometimes compassion just gets kicked down pretty far in the conversation. And we got to work through all those things before it even comes up. And sometimes it doesn't come up much at all. You know, in fact, there are people who would argue that when it comes to making these decisions, the people who make them need to put compassion on the back burner because we need to make these decisions with our head and not our hearts. We got to be rational, not emotional. We got to do what's best, just from what's best's sakes, not from. And I think there's an argument to be made there. But that argument only holds for people outside the faith community. Because if we call ourselves members of the faith community, if we call ourselves Christ followers, we don't have the luxury of removing compassion from the decisions that we make. We don't have that luxury. Now, I want to be clear, figuring out what compassion looks like, you can define compassion in a lot of different ways. And we can actually come up with a very different response on how we're going to answer these questions. We can be on different sides of the problem. And both of us making our answers based on compassion, right? Because compassion is different. It's not a hard line. There's different ways that we can look at that. But what I'm suggesting is that as a people of faith, we don't have the luxury of compassion not being there. We don't get to put it on the back burner. And if we put it on the back burner, then we don't get to call ourselves Christ followers, right? Our faith, at the center of our faith, the story of David, the story of Jesus, the story of Christianity, at the heart of that is unmerited, undeserved grace, which is founded on compassion. It's Christianity 101, right? To argue against compassion is to argue against the gospel, period. Now, this is what I've experienced as a pastor when I've talked about anything that could be considered political in the life of the church, is that not long after I talk about it, I get some emails. And some of you might be writing those emails right now in your head, right? I get some emails. And what I love about this church and kind of the way we approach it is we can talk about the same issue, and I'm going to get an email from someone over here, and I'm going to get an email from someone over here. Both of them saying, what are you doing? It's too much, you're too much, let's talk about this, let's talk about this, let's talk about this. What are you doing, right? So this is what I want to say to you. This is what I want to say to those of you who are composing emails in your head right now. Or thinking about what you want to say to me after worship. Bring it. Look, I really don't mind critique. I really don't mind disagreement. I welcome it. But this is what I want to make very, very clear. I am not advocating any public policy right now. I am not doing that. Do not walk away from here and say that I'm doing that. I am not doing that. The only policy that I'm advocating is the policy of compassion. That is it. And I will and forever advocate for compassion because I'm a Christ follower, and as a Christ follower, I don't have the option to choose any other path. Do you remember back in the day, it wasn't too long ago, where everybody was wearing those WWJD bracelets, What Would Jesus Do? Remember that? I really was not a big fan of that. I just didn't, for whatever reason, I didn't like it. But I love the question. And sometimes I wonder if we don't need to make that question more central to who it is that we are and who it is that we seek to be. When it comes to questions about who gets to be at what table, who gets to sit there, who gets to do this, who gets to do that, who have what rights, who have what privileges, when it comes to that conversation, are we asking ourselves, what would Jesus do here? What would he do? And if we don't know what Jesus would do, because Jesus lived 2,000 years ago, and 2,000 years ago the world was very different, we can ask ourselves, if Jesus was here, and I told Jesus what I was doing, would Jesus be okay with it? Would Jesus say, yeah, that's exactly what I want you to do? Because here's what I think we know. I think we know more often than not what Jesus would do. I really do. And I think we get it. But I've also heard people more than once say, I know Jesus would do this, but in the real world, right? If you're a Christ follower and your answer to the question is, I know what Jesus would do, but in the real world, you better be doggone sure what comes next is pleasing to God. Because when we choose a path that Jesus would revile, we've chosen the wrong path, even if it's for all the right reasons. Look at this story today. In the story of David, he does something unthinkable in that world. He leverages power for the marginalized enemy of his throne. And the reason that he does that is because David has a heart for God, and David sees the person in Mephibosheth. And he offers unmerited, undeserved, unasked for grace. Think about the story of our faith. Think about the God that we worship. God gives us compassion and grace, every one of us. We may not be broken like Mephibosheth, but we are broken. We are broken and we are fallen. We cannot stand on our own, and we do not deserve by our own merits a seat at the table. but through the grace of God, it's been given to us. Having been loved in such a way, we have no choice but to love others as we were loved first. And as we think about what it looks like to bring people to table, my prayer for us is we'll remember David's story. Because I think David's story and how he responds to Mephibosheth is a story we all need to keep in mind, even if it's our kitchen table or something much bigger. Amen.